The joke lasted 25 years. That was the remarkable part. Not 25 minutes. Not 25 days. 25 years. An entire generation laughed at Margaret Hale's jam stand. And Margaret never once corrected them. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, she parked the same faded pickup truck at the county farmer's market. Same location. Same folding tables. Same homemade signs. Same glass jars. Blackberry jam. Peach preserves. Fig spread. Strawberry jam. Apple butter. Week after week. Year after year. People saw the same thing. A woman selling jam. Nothing more. That was their first mistake. The second mistake was assuming Margaret cared what they thought. One July morning in 1991, Dale Harper stopped at the market as he always did. Margaret stood behind her tables arranging jars. The morning sun reflected through the glass. Everything looked exactly as it had looked for years. Dale picked up a jar, examined the label, then grinned. "You ever gonna retire?" Margaret smiled slightly. "From what?" "This." He waved toward the table. "The jam." Long pause. Then, "Why would I?" Dale laughed. "Because you've been doing it forever." Margaret shrugged. "Seems to be working." The answer amused him. Because everybody believed they understood Margaret's situation. A small farm. A small orchard. A small business. Nothing special. Nothing remarkable. Just enough to get by. At least that's what people assumed. The Hale farm sat outside town on land originally purchased by Samuel Hale, Margaret's grandfather, a stubborn man with unusual ideas about money. One summer evening, when Margaret was 14, she followed him through a blackberry patch behind the orchard. Buckets sat between rows. The setting sun painted everything gold. Samuel filled another bucket, then pointed toward a neighboring property. An old 80-acre farm. Rundown. Overgrown. For sale. "See that?" Margaret nodded. "The Johnson place?" "Yes." Long pause. Then, "What's wrong with it?" Samuel smiled. "Nothing." She looked confused. "Then why's nobody buying it?" Samuel dropped another handful of berries into the bucket, then answered, "Because they're looking at the price." Silence. Then, "What should they look at?" He pointed toward the land. "The future." That answer stayed with her. Because Samuel treated land differently than everyone else. Most people viewed land as an expense. Samuel viewed it as storage. A place to keep value. A place where money could work quietly. Years later, Margaret understood exactly what he meant. After Samuel passed away, she inherited the original farm, along with notebooks, hundreds of them, financial records, land purchases, tax documents, handwritten observations, everything. One particular notebook fascinated her, because Samuel tracked neighboring properties, constantly. Ownership changes, estate sales, mortgage problems, auction notices, every piece of information. At first it seemed strange. Then she noticed a pattern. Whenever land became available, Samuel paid attention. Not always. Not recklessly. Patiently. The lesson stayed. Years later, Margaret started making jam. Originally because the orchard produced more fruit than local buyers wanted. Blackberries, peaches, figs, apples, everything. Rather than waste it, she preserved it. The first market season earned modest money. The second earned slightly more. The third earned enough to matter. Most people would have spent the profits. Margaret didn't. She saved them. Every dollar. Every season. The county didn't notice. Because nobody pays much attention to a jam stand. One autumn afternoon, a neighboring 20-acre parcel came up for sale. Nothing special. A narrow strip bordering the Hale farm. The owner passed away. The heirs lived out of state. They wanted a quick sale. Margaret bought it. Quietly. Nobody noticed. 3 years later, another property became available. 30 acres. Margaret bought that too. Quietly. Still nobody noticed. The process repeated. Again, and again, and again. Not every year. Not every opportunity. Only when the numbers worked. Only when the land fit. Patience became the strategy. One evening, Emily Hale sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table. Maps covered every available surface. Property maps. Tax maps. Survey maps. Everything. Emily looked around. "You're doing it again." Margaret looked up. "What?" "The maps." Silence. "The maps. That means you're thinking." Long pause. Then, "Yes." Emily sighed. "Dangerous. Very dangerous." "What kind of thinking?" Margaret pointed toward a highlighted property boundary. "Land." Emily immediately smiled. Because land thinking rarely ended poorly. "How much?" Margaret pointed. 40 acres. Silence. Then, "You buying it?" "Maybe." That answer usually meant yes. The county remained completely unaware. Mostly because people preferred simpler explanations. They saw Margaret selling jam every Saturday. Therefore, Margaret must need money. Simple, easy, comforting. Reality proved more complicated. One afternoon at the diner, Dale pointed toward the market square. Margaret's truck sat visible through the window. She's out there again. Rick looked up. Who? Margaret. Long pause. The jam lady? Dale nodded. The jam lady. Laughter spread around the table. Not cruel laughter. Just casual. Dismissive. The kind people use when they think they've already figured someone out. Nobody mentioned land. Nobody mentioned purchases. Nobody mentioned deeds. Because nobody knew. Years passed. Then more years. The market became part of local routine. Children grew up seeing Margaret stand. Then brought their own children. The jam remained. The assumptions remained too. One spring morning, the county bank held an auction. A struggling farm operation had collapsed. 200 acres became available. Good ground. Productive ground. The kind everybody wanted. The auction room filled quickly. Farmers. Investors. Speculators. Everyone. Margaret sat quietly near the back. As usual, most people barely noticed. Why would they? She sold jam. The bidding started aggressively. Prices climbed. Then climbed higher. One by one, bidders dropped out. Eventually, only two remained. A regional investor. And Margaret Hale. The room became quieter. Then quieter still. The investor made another bid. Margaret responded immediately. Another bid. Another response. Finally, the investor stopped. The auctioneer raised his hammer. Sold. Silence. Absolute silence. Then somebody whispered, Margaret. The room turned. Because suddenly everyone remembered something uncomfortable. Nobody actually knew how much money Margaret had. And for the first time, people started wondering. Over the next 5 years, the questions grew. Because Margaret kept buying. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Steadily. Quietly. The acreage accumulated. 20 acres. 40 acres. 80 acres. Another 60. Another 100. The county noticed pieces. Never the whole picture. Nobody added the numbers together. Until one afternoon at the courthouse. That's when a young title clerk accidentally did the math. And suddenly discovered something that would leave the entire county speechless. The discovery happened on a Tuesday. Not because anyone was looking. Because someone got curious. The county courthouse processed property records every day. Deeds. Transfers. Estate filings. Routine paperwork. Most of it disappeared into filing cabinets, and nobody thought about it again. But a young title clerk named Brian Foster noticed something unusual. The same name kept appearing. Again, and again, and again. Hale, Hale, Hale. At first he assumed it was coincidence. Then he started counting. 20 acres. 40 acres. 60 acres. 80 acres. Another parcel. Then another. Then another. The total kept growing. Brian eventually grabbed a county map. Then a calculator. Then another calculator. Because he thought the first one must be wrong. It wasn't. The number sat there plainly. 920 acres. Free and clear. No corporate ownership. No investment group. No partnership. Just Margaret Hale. The jam lady. Brian stared at the paperwork. Then did what every small-town employee eventually does. He told someone. By lunchtime, 3 people knew. By dinner, 30 people knew. By the following morning, the entire county knew. The reaction followed a predictable pattern. First disbelief. Then confusion. Then curiosity. Then embarrassment. Because everybody suddenly realized something uncomfortable. They'd spent 25 years talking about Margaret, without actually understanding anything about her. The diner exploded first. Naturally, Dale Harper walked through the door, carrying a county map. Then dropped it onto a table. No. Rick looked up. What? Dale pointed dramatically. No. Silence. What? Margaret. Long pause. What about Margaret? Dale unfolded the map. Colored sections stretched across half the township. Every highlighted parcel belonged to the same owner. The room became quiet. Very quiet. Then, no. Yes. No. Yes. Rick leaned closer. Then froze. 920? Dale nodded. Free and clear. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Because suddenly every joke about the jam stand felt different. One afternoon, Margaret arrived at the market as usual. Same truck. Same folding tables. Same glass jars. Nothing had changed. Except the people. Customers stared. Farmers stared. Everybody stared. Margaret noticed immediately. Of course she did. She'd spent decades reading people. Dale appeared 20 minutes later. Naturally, he walked straight to the stand, picked up a jar, then set it down. Long silence. Finally, "You own 920 acres?" Margaret smiled slightly. "Yes." Silence. Then, "Why didn't you tell anybody?" That question followed her everywhere afterward. At church, at the co-op, at the diner, at the feed store. Everyone wanted the same answer. "Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret never understood the confusion, because from her perspective, nothing had changed. One evening, Emily sat beside her on the porch overlooking rolling fields. The setting sun painted the land gold. Much of the visible ground belonged to the Hale family now, not through inheritance, not through luck, purchase by purchase. Year after year, Emily looked toward the horizon. They really didn't know. Margaret laughed softly. "No." Long pause. Then, "Why didn't you tell them?" Margaret looked across the fields, then shrugged. Nobody asked. That answer became famous. People repeated it everywhere, mostly because it annoyed them. 1 month later, the County Agricultural Association invited Margaret to speak, something they had never done before. The room filled quickly. Farmers packed every chair. People stood along walls. Everyone wanted answers. Margaret stood at the front, uncomfortable. Public speaking ranked somewhere between dental work and drought on her list of favorite activities. The association president smiled. "Everyone wants to know how you did it." Margaret blinked. "Did what?" The room laughed. Because apparently she still didn't understand why people were fascinated. The president pointed toward the audience. "The land." Silence. Then, "Oh." Long pause. Slowly, the room laughed again. Margaret wasn't joking. She continued. "1 parcel at a time." Nobody wrote that down. They expected something more dramatic. A secret strategy, a hidden formula, a complicated investment system. Instead, Margaret explained exactly what happened. She sold jam, saved profits, bought land when opportunities appeared, repeated the process. For 25 years. One farmer finally raised his hand. "What was the trick?" Margaret frowned. "Trick? Yes." Silence. Then, there wasn't one. The room grew quiet. Because deep down, everyone knew she was telling the truth. The strategy sounded almost boring. Patience, discipline, consistency. The things people rarely celebrate because they take too long. After the meeting, several younger farmers stayed behind. They asked questions. Real questions. Not about wealth. About decisions. One asked which purchase mattered most. Margaret thought for several seconds. Then smiled. The first one. Silence. Then, "Why?" She pointed toward the county map hanging on the wall. "Because after the first one, I stopped thinking like a buyer." Long pause. "I started thinking like an owner." That answer stayed with people. Years later, they still repeated it. One autumn evening, Dale stood beside Margaret overlooking hundreds of acres of pasture and orchard. The wind moved softly through the grass. The same market where she sold jam sat visible in the distance. Tiny from where they stood. Dale folded his arms. "You know what still bothers me?" Margaret smiled slightly. "What?" He pointed toward town. "We called you the jam lady." "Yes." "No, seriously." Long pause. "For 25 years. Margaret looked toward the horizon, then back at him. "That's all right." Silence. Then, "Why?" She smiled. "Because I was the jam lady." The answer surprised him. Because it was true. She never pretended otherwise. The jam stand wasn't a disguise. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't an act. It was simply one part of a much larger story nobody bothered to notice. For 25 years, the county saw Margaret Hale standing behind folding tables selling preserves every Saturday morning. They saw jars, labels, fruit, small cash sales. They thought they understood everything. Meanwhile, Margaret quietly bought neighboring parcels. One farm, then another, then another. Not because she chased wealth. Because she believed what Samuel taught her years earlier. Land wasn't an expense. It was the future. And while everyone laughed at the woman selling jam, she was quietly becoming one of the largest landowners in the entire county. 1 jar at a time.